So in attendance are Dr. Brearey, Dr. Jayaram, Paul Hughes, a by now infamous figure from the Cheshire Constabulary, and Nigel Wenham. There's also Dr. Susie Holt, but she says practically nothing in this meeting and essentially makes no contribution at all. So the meeting begins 10:21 a.m. and Nigel Wenham welcomes everyone and outlines the purpose of the meeting. This is to review the contents of the report that was sent to Nigel Wenham last week, titled Reason for Concerns Regarding a Possible Criminal Cause for Increased Neonatal Mortality at the Countess Chester Hospital NHS Foundation Trust, June 2015 to June 2016. Now, we'd all love to see that report, but unfortunately, that is classified. So, there's some general stuff at the start here where the police are trying to understand more about the current operation of the ward, which is perfectly reasonable. So 7 paediatrics and neonatal combined post consultants employed by the Countess Chester NHS Foundation Trust during this time period. Business case was approved in January 2016 for 2 new consultants in keeping with national NHS recommendations. An 8th consultant, Dr. McGuigan, was employed in January 2017, and interviews for 9th consultant took place on the day of the meeting. Dr. Liz Newby was in one of the consultant posts until March 2016, when she left to work in Stepping Hill and was succeeded by Dr. Susie Holt. The funding of the neonatal unit is split. There is specialised commissioning through NHS England pay for care on the neonatal unit, and some care of newborn infants is funded by CCG. None of that really is of any interest to us, and certainly of no real importance, but I suppose it's reasonable for them to discuss this before the meeting began. So NHS Improvement is not involved, so that's just one of the many organisations that are involved in the running of the NHS. It really is quite a complex structure that is involved in running the NHS. NHS Improvement is just one of many organisations that are involved. So it's stated here that Stephen Brearey was very keen from the start to involve the neonatal network. Part of network care across Cheshire and Mersey, there is some degree of accountability in the network, for example, mortality reviews. So I'm not really sure the significance of involving the neonatal network. That doesn't seem to have happened, but for whatever reason, they've decided to involve the police. We're going to discuss this more as it continues, so I don't want to dwell on that too much at this point. So now in fact, we're going to discuss it immediately. So Ravi Jayaram here says, if you have concerns about a doctor, you would report it to the GMC. Concerns about a nurse to Nurse and Midwifery Council. So immediately you could say, as you have specific concerns here about a nurse, there's an argument that you could report this to the Nurse and Midwifery Council. However, he continues, if wider issue like this escalate through the trust. So here they're kind of pretending that it's a wider issue, but by the end of this meeting, they've made it crystal clear that they suspect a nurse. So as they do quite explicitly have concerns about a nurse, according to their own account, they could have contacted the Nurse and Midwifery Council. There are other bodies that they could also have contacted other than the police, as we will see as this particular comment continues. So he says in the very next sentence, it's regarded as whistleblowing if you go outside. So I can... Well, actually, let me just read the next sentence before I comment on this. We have taken advice from our medical defence unions to do everything within the trust and deal that route. So that's fair enough. The medical defence unions told them to deal with things within the trust, which they've tried to do. But as they rightly recognise here, if they were to go outside the trust, then it would be whistleblowing. So a typical thing to do would be to go to the Care Quality Commission. And there's some discussion later on about how there should have been a multidisciplinary review, which is a very fair opinion. That is essentially what should have happened. Clearly, it's not what did happen, as we'll be discussing later in the video. But if they were seriously whistleblowers, then from the moment Lucy Letby was thrown off the neonatal unit and put in an administrative role, they would have done actual whistleblowing. They would have gone to external organisations and said, we're very concerned about what's happening at the hospital. There needs to be a medical investigation. Now, with regard to why they didn't do that, in previous videos I've already expressed my opinion. I think the simple reason is cowardice. I think they don't want to do whistleblowing. They don't want to be whistleblowers because they know there could be consequences for them. So they're trying to do this in a way that ensures that they don't have to deal with any consequences, but that it can be looked at and their concerns can be escalated. Even at this time, whatever we think about this, whatever we think about what occurred in the meeting, whatever we think about their conduct generally, whatever we think about the fact they got involved in the police investigation later on, whatever we think about what occurred in court and what they said in court, whatever we think about them as people, their concerns can still be genuine at this point. They can be genuinely speaking to the police because they're genuinely concerned. And I believe it's extremely misguided to think that the police are the best people to deal with this. I just simply don't agree with that. However, their concerns can still be genuine. I just think if anything was to be done, then it would be a multidisciplined medical review run by medical bodies. There'd already been the Care Quality Commission. There'd already been the RCPCH review. There'd already been internal procedures. If those internal procedures and external procedures run by credible medical bodies hadn't uncovered anything, there is no credible reason to believe that the police, Cheshire Police, that this is in Blacon, just outside Chester, I believe the police station is located. There is no reason to believe that a relatively small police constabulary with no medical experience, with no medical expertise, will be able to unpick this complicated case that the RCPCH and the Care Quality Commission and other internal procedures, they have not been able to reveal anything that would constitute a crime, as acknowledged by the police. So believing that the police will then be able to investigate this situation and do what we see Brearey and Jayaram request them to do later, there is just simply no reason to believe that would occur. So with regard to whistleblowing, I just want to take a quick look at this article. Charity refused to engage with Letby whistleblowers over red flags in testimony. This relates to charity Compassion in Care. A major whistleblowing charity refused to engage with the doctors who blame Lucy Letby for a spike in baby deaths because of red flags over their conduct. It has emerged. And then I'll go on to the actual quotes here from Eileen Chubb. We'd never come across a whistleblower who, if backed into a corner by an employer or the NHS, hadn't dialed 999 when people's lives had been at risk. That's what we found staggering. It stood out like a sore thumb, especially in a case where there were other such serious concerns. I've never seen a whistleblower who thought babies were being harmed who left it for more than a week, but in this case they left it for a number of years. And you find that when there is a group of whistleblowers, the wrongdoing gets reported even quicker. Then there's more comments here. Straight away from day one, as soon as the verdict came through, we all said, these are not whistleblowers. The whole thing looked really suspicious to us. They didn't meet any of the criteria, a lot of the detail which wasn't there. Because we deal with health and social care, you see patterns that are always there. Most whistleblowers would say to you, I can remember the moment when this first happened, and it's ingrained into your memory like a hot iron, the detail on what you saw, but that was not there in this case. All of it is completely wrong. It's also very unusual for whistleblowers to keep their jobs. Most are sacked, and if they are not, they are forced out constructively. It's made us reassess everything. If there wasn't whistleblowing, then the whole thing falls for us. So some very interesting points made there. I should say that I've spoken to Eileen, and she gave me an enormous amount of material. I wish I could use all of it, but I've used a small amount, and perhaps she'll come onto the channel at some point. We'll see. But she's a great person. I really respect what she does, and some of the key points she made to me, and that she's kind of reiterated here, were that if you're going to be a whistleblower, it involves risk. It involves you making a sacrifice. It involves you sticking your neck on the line. That's why she's talking about this. Most are sacked or forced out constructively. And that's why it's my opinion that the reason Brearey and Jayaram have handled this the way that they have is because they don't want to take any risks. But later on, they were happy to accept the praise of being a whistleblower. So they want to have their cake and eat it, and so far they've got away with it. But the walls are closing in on them, in my opinion. I'll also say that this expression about remembering the moment when it first happened and it being ingrained into your memory like a hot iron. So we later, there was quite a famous interview where Jayaram with ITV claimed that Lucy supposedly removing a tube in the case of Child K was etched into his memory. But we're going to see later in this interview that he's going to mention it for the first time when it occurred over 450 days previously. And then Sally Holt says guidance is available online from the BMA and GMC. That's virtually the only thing she says in the meeting. Stephen Brearey says that I invited college reviews like the one from September. That was service review. They did recommend multi-service review. Stephen Brearey, the case notes reviewed by Dr. Horden did assess some cases. This was not what the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health review asked for. What happened was one neonatologist looked at case notes. This was not multidiscipline review that was suggested. So let's just reflect on that for a second before we just read the last sentence. So here, Dr. Brearey is advocating that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health did a review and then they advocated for something to occur, and that what has occurred at the Cancer Chester at that time was not satisfactory to Dr. Brearey. So I'll assume for the sake of argument that view is sincere. So then he is critical because there's been one neonatologist looking at the case notes and that there hasn't been a multidiscipline review. So as I've already discussed, that would be a perfectly legitimate thing to happen, and ideally that should occur. If anything should occur at all, it should be a very high-level, multidiscipline medical investigation, which you could argue is exactly what's happened from this panel of 14, now 26 experts that are involved with the defence. Of course, well, before we reflect on Dr. Evans' review, let's just say this. Why Dr. Brearey would think the police can organise this, or even understand this, I have no idea. There's no particular reason why they would be the best people to do this. So it's very strange that you wouldn't go to another medical body. And as I say, the only reason that I can think for that is just pure cowardice and self-interest, that he didn't want to get in trouble for being a whistleblower. And so he's kind of, him and Jayaram have kind of managed to weasel their way in at the police station without risking anything, essentially. Now, when we move on to what then happened, ultimately, in the Cheshire Constabulary investigation, in no way was that a multidiscipline review. It was 95% Dr. Evans going through the case notes. And as we'll see in a future video, by the time they're interviewing Lucy, they've already decided that there's inflicted harm and that there's suspicious activity. And it hasn't been a multidiscipline review. It's just been Dr. Evans looking at the case notes. So basically, they've replaced a procedure that Stephen Brearey is suggesting here is unsatisfactory, and then they've replaced it with a much worse process in which at least they've had people examine the infants. At least there's been a coroner, a neonatologist, and a pathologist. They then replace that, because they're not happy with it, with a retired paediatrician looking at the case notes on his own, which doesn't even come close to the standard of anything that they're asking for. And I do think Cheshire Police should have been able to understand this, but obviously they couldn't. And then just to read the last sentence from this page, Trust can have root cause analysis to invite professionals in to do review of whole case. These tend to be single case, not cohort reviews. So there's not too much to say about that. It seems clear to me that some sort of multidiscipline medical review should have been arranged through the Trust. There's no way this, in my view, this meeting should never have taken place, regardless of its content. So the meeting continues. CQC, that's the Care Quality Commission, have a responsibility for all NHS organisations and private. As clinicians, very unusual for us to go direct. This would be more whistleblowing. So essentially just repeating this comment about whistleblowing, which they obviously want to avoid doing. We have not directly contacted the CQC. Advice from legal reps was exhaust all possibilities first. Now, I don't know. It's impossible for me to say whether or not that comment is true. It's impossible for me to say whether or not they actually sought legal advice. They may have sought legal advice. In my view, it would be very strange for a legal representative to say you should exhaust all possibilities and then go to the Care Quality Commission. They may have been advised this, as I mentioned previously, so that it's kind of a risk-free endeavour for them, essentially. But if you're going to the police and then you exhaust that possibility, that is surely the final port of call. How can you possibly then credibly go to the Care Quality Commission and say, well, we've been to the police, we asked the police to investigate, and they say there's no reason to do so, now we want you to do something? I mean, the Care Quality Commission are going to laugh in your face, presumably. That would be a natural reaction anyway. So, I mean, I'm a little bit sceptical about this. They may have been advised that, but I think the police are the people you go to last, surely. That would be my opinion. Then Ravi Jayaram says, the JH review, meaning the Jane Holden review, specifically mentioned forensic review. We cannot conduct that level of review. That's a fair comment. The fact is these babies would not be the ones you would have expected at the point they collapsed, and they did not respond physiologically to the treatment as expected. So I'll say two things to that. Firstly, it is true, I think it's a fair comment, that the hospital cannot conduct the level of review they're referring to. However, why would you think the police could conduct a forensic multidiscipline review? There's no reason to believe that. It's obviously going to be a massive challenge for them to be able to engage in any kind of medical investigation. So it just seems utterly illogical to go to the police. The logical thing to do would be to go to a medical body, obviously such as the Care Quality Commission. The Care Quality Commission would be the obvious choice. Simple reason they're coming to the police is they feel they can do it without risk for themselves. In terms of the babies not being the ones you would have expected to collapse, we'll be assessing that as the video continues, but this is not really an entirely accurate or fair comment. I think it's reasonable to say. So then there's just a bullet point about understanding more detail of their concerns. And then Stephen Brearey says, of the 9 we reviewed initially, 6 out of 9 collapsed between midnight and 4 a.m, which was highly unusual. So I've found research that suggests that infants collapsing and dying between these hours is not as unusual as is suggested here, firstly. And then secondly, nurses have told me that overnight it can be problematical. There's obvious reasons why this would be the case. There's less staff around. But it just seems to be a time of the day when, at least anecdotally and based on some research, there can be more problems. So Stephen Brearey can quite legitimately believe that this is highly unusual, but it's perhaps not as unusual as he believes. Then he says, one of the actions was to review the period prior and nothing was found. We'll share these reviewed. That review also noticed a significant number of collapses. So that's not particularly contentious. I do think they probably had genuine concern about the number of deaths on the unit and the number of collapses. Following on from that thematic, we discussed the nurse Lucy Letby, but no action taken. So they're making it very clear. It's not merely the fact they've identified her. It's not merely the fact that there's no way you could come away from this conversation and not know that they suspect a nurse, as you'll see by the end of it. It's not merely the fact they've made it so clear that it's Lucy Letby you couldn't possibly believe anything else, but they really just throughout the discussion they hammer home the fact that they suspect a nurse. So they previously said, oh, we're not here to just discuss a nurse, but when you look at what was actually said, that claim doesn't really stand up to much scrutiny. The other thing, of course, to note is if there was a non-human related cause, that the hospital is being asked, Countess of Chester rather wrote to the police to ask them to exclude unnatural causes. So once they've excluded the idea that there's a murder, excluded the idea of malignant behaviour, how the hell can they possibly find a medical cause for what's been going on, or multiple complex medical causes that are nuanced? As I've said previously, one of the big problems in this investigation, one of the big problems broadly speaking, is that the police want a black and white explanation because that's usual for them. It's usual for there to be a crime and for there to be a suspect and for there to be a fairly simple explanation. As we've seen from the panel reports, we're talking about very complex, nuanced medical information that is reliant on numerous interlinking factors, and it just can't be resolved as simply as a usual crime. So how you'd expect the police to do that once they had excluded a murderer, I have no idea. And then Stephen Brearey says, I shared the report with Ian Harvey prior to the CQC inspection, February. At this time, the nurse had been put on day shifts for mentoring reasons. Question from the police, confirm how many that nurse has been present. The nurse was present in all but one of the deaths. So already you can see this is all veering towards just discussing Lucy and discussing the suspicions about Lucy. And we see there's the Operation Hummingbird film that was made. I won't call it a documentary, it's not a documentary. And we see in that, it's very clear that they essentially focused in on Lucy Letby very early on in the process and never really considered anything else. And we can see in this meeting that Brearey and Jayaram are just focusing on Lucy, on the presence of Lucy. They're making it very clear what their suspicions are. And then Cheshire Police picked that baton up and ran with it, essentially. So then Jayaram says, the staffing review has looked at the notes. This has not necessarily been picked up. What has not been looked at, this baby collapsed, who was where, what were you doing at the time? As consultants, it is very rare that consultants were present at the time of collapse. So essentially here he's just absolving himself of any responsibility and saying, look, it can't possibly be anything to do with the consultants. And it seems that the police just accepted that. The police, they never for 1 second considered that the consultants should be suspects. And indeed, these two turn up to the police station and then pretty soon after that they start involving them in the investigation. It seems to me that that's a rather... it would be generous to describe it as naive or gullible. There's just no way that should happen. On no level should that ever happen. I don't think anyone could possibly disagree with that. Even the biggest believer in Lucy's guilt should be able to see that you can't have the accusers who walk in there and make this whole investigation doesn't even happen without this meeting. And yet this meeting takes place and then they say, oh, Dr. Brearey and Dr. Jayaram, why don't you start looking through the notes? In fact, why don't you just hand us the cases? In fact, why don't you run the whole investigation? It's frankly staggering. Staggeringly unprofessional and staggeringly inappropriate. At the point of the collapse, the nurse was present at that time in close proximity. This has not happened to other staff. Of course, we now know this is not true. It's not true that Lucy was there for all the collapses. This is essentially just a mistaken impression. And also, relative to the number of shifts she did compared to other people on the unit, she wasn't necessarily even present for a disproportionately large amount of time. But when you look at the court case, when you look at what actually occurred, essentially she was just a very attentive nurse who was always there, responding quickly to collapses and often raising the alarm. So that shouldn't be viewed as suspicious necessarily, or it certainly more generally speaking shouldn't be viewed as suspicious. But for some reason they've put two and two together and created a lot more than four in this case. I can speak about one that did collapse but survived 27 weeks, was stable, had breathing tube down, good ventilation, named nurse, i.e. nurse assigned to care for baby during that particular shift, had gone out of nursery. I went back in, the baby's oxygen levels had dropped. First thing to do, disconnect baby from ventilator and bag. I noticed the breathing tube had been dislodged. The nurse was present at the time. So it's probably obvious to people that know the case well that this is child K. So this is the first time that Jayaram has managed to mention child K to anyone, and this supposed deliberate dislodging of the breathing tube, although he doesn't make that specific allegation here, but he insinuates that quite strongly. And he's been through, for example, the Care Quality Commission and their review. He's been through the RCPCH review. He's been through Lucy's grievance procedure. He's been through countless internal processes at the hospital. He's been asked for evidence repeatedly by Ian Harvey and Tony Chambers, to name but two. He's never managed to say anything previously, despite the fact this incident is supposed to have taken place over 450 days previously. This is the first time that he's ever mentioning it. The second thing is, even here his version of events seems pretty dubious, and of course we know he's contradicted that elsewhere. So then Dr. Jayaram says, there is a perception that we are on a campaign. This is not the case. So I just want to show you a document from the Thirlwell inquiry that somewhat contradicts that particular assertion. So this is from Lucy's grievance procedure, an interview of Yvonne Griffiths by Dr. Chris Green on the 18th of October 2016. And you can see that I've highlighted where Yvonne Griffiths said that there was a witch hunt on the unit. And I'll read a little bit more of this as well. So it's written here as Stephen Brearey, but I'll just say Stephen Brearey. Steve Brearey voiced his concerns. I was there because EP, which is Arian Powell, couldn't attend. Steve Brearey wanted to go to the Cheshire Executive, and we said you can't just do that on a gut feeling. He got Ravi and Dr. V on board. It's not like Steve Brearey to cause trouble, but we had looked at the information, and the only thing seems to be that she was on duty. Stephen Brearey had voiced concerns prior to the loss of the two triplets. They said that if they didn't go to the Chief Executive, they would be going straight to the police. We were very uncomfortable. We told them to take their concerns to Lucy, but they were adamant. I think they wanted her fired immediately. I found it very difficult to act on something I didn't believe in. It was a witch hunt. I hate the secrecy. There's an interesting comment here that they were frightened she would go to the police herself about the allegations. But yeah, and so then again, another interesting comment here, I think they were pacified by Lucy moving to another area and doing the external review, contain and control. So if they had serious questions about Lucy supposedly being a murderer, then why would they be reassured by her moving to another area of the hospital this is referencing? So that's all very strange, but it's worth considering that this experienced nurses on the unit believes that this was a witch hunt. There talks about Stephen Brearey getting Ravi Jayaram and a second consultant on board. Prior to that, there was no concerns of anyone at all. So already we know that several things they said in this interview are simply untrue. And again, please consider the significance of the fact that there was going to be no investigation into this. But Cheshire Police have allowed Brearey and Jayaram to walk in there and provide them with information, much of which is inaccurate, some of which is demonstrably untrue. And these people, particularly Dr. Brearey, has run what Yvonne Griffiths describes as a witch hunt against Lucy Letby on the unit. Then they walk into the police station and name Lucy Letby. They might as well just have walked in there and say, we think Lucy Letby is a suspect, why don't you investigate her? And then just terminate the meeting. They make it absolutely crystal clear that they suspect Lucy, and that has clearly had an influence, a very significant influence on the direction of police inquiry. So immediately Dr. Jayaram says other consultants and junior doctors had come to the same view, whereas in reality Dr. Brearey kind of massaged opinion on the unit, is one way that you could put it. And other consultants had serious concerns. Dr. John Gibbs expressed serious concerns. Dr. Salady was not at all on board and had serious concerns about the direction they were going in, and expressed the view that all they had was this coincidence that is also referenced by Arian Powell and referenced in that document now by Yvonne Griffiths as well, and of course referenced by the police when it was first referred to the police. So I think for them to claim that, this is just something that spontaneously happened in the hospital and everyone just gradually came round to the same view as us and we didn't have anything to do with it, is not very well founded. So he then says it got to the point that when Nurse was on duty, we feared something would happen. So they couldn't have made it any clearer as to why they're here. That this is not the final reference, of course. There's more references to Lucy to come. But the idea that we want you to keep an open mind, that they pretended at the start of the interview, just doesn't stand up to any scrutiny. Then we get the ironic statement that we are not on a witch hunt, but there's actually more than one person on the unit that specifically described it as a witch hunt. So it's quite ironic that he would claim that they were not on a witch hunt. We have concerns that so we're not on a witch hunt. What's his very next statement? We have concerns that this nurse was present in far too many occasions. So we're not here to just target one person. I mean, do you actually know what a witch hunt is, Ravi? I would ask you. Because it's where you systematically undermine someone and systematically attack someone who's female. That's what a witch hunt is, essentially. So what are you on if not a witch hunt, exactly? Because you just come into the police station here and it's just Lucy, nurse. But hey, keep an open mind. It could be for any reason. And then he goes on to say, provided example of baby that was being treated for low blood sugars, very erratic pattern of sugar level which changed with shift pattern, no clinical explanation, consulted with older Hay, who agreed was unable to explain. Stephen Brearey, we have looked hard, we cannot find any explanation. So I think a lot of the problem for these two is that they missed things on the unit that someone who was more skilled would have seen. And they just missed relatively subtle things. In some cases, they miss things that aren't even subtle at all. And then there's a couple of bullet points. Identify any specific evidence of any criminal or suspected criminal activity. Clarify some aspects regarding the pathology and causes of death. So move on to the next page now. There's a question from the police. 3 cases were certified by doctors on wards. Why? And Stephen Brearey says, 1 baby, 29 weeks, felt that baby displaying typical signs of necrotizing enterocolitis. Felt at time this was not suspicious. The baby had abdominal x-ray an hour before death. There was no signs of necrotizing enterocolitis. The fact x-ray was normal is odd. As an isolated case, he would not have been considered suspicious, but assessed on the timeline, there are concerns. So there's a couple of things to say about this. Firstly, we'll see later on that they say, these infants are over 32 weeks. So that there's obviously here citing one that is 29 weeks. We'll discuss that in more detail when that comes up. The second thing is, he states here, as an isolated case, this would have not been considered suspicious. So it's only due to their brilliant theory that Lucy was around a lot that they even threw this into the case. And this ultimately did end up in court because this is child E. Now, Dr. Brearey perhaps could have mentioned that child E lost 25% of its blood at least and had a massive gastrointestinal bleed, and that's clearly the cause of death. But he didn't seem to notice that. So we'll move on to the next question. Questioned on the cause of death and pathology. As Dr. Stephen Brearey says, this is what post-mortem diagnosis is. Neo is so hard. So obviously that's not very well transcribed in this meeting. Don't know entirely what is meant by that. Jane Horden review identified those 4 cases. We also reviewed these another 4. We felt there were unexpected or unexplained causes of death. There are several babies with clear genetic diagnosis. Some cases the post-mortem does not explain why the babies suddenly collapsed and died. So obviously that is their opinion. I'm not going to go into that too much at this point in time because there's stuff later on that relates to this. Do you consult with the pathologist regarding post-mortem findings? Outline that this was not normal practice. Communication would take place between the pathologist and the coroner. What we should probably emphasise at this point is that, of course, the pathologist and coroner in this case and a senior neonatologist in Dr. Jane Horden examined these cases. And while some aspects of them were unexplained, to completely overturn everything that was done and overlook some far more obvious causes of death and far more obvious contributions to their collapses and illness was certainly very strange. And that is not something that should have occurred. And actually, Dr. Stephen Brearey and Dr. Ravi Jayaram didn't request for that to happen. What they requested for was a forensic review. It's just that the forensic review never took place. The police didn't have a clue what to do. Dr. Evans turned up, basically wedged himself into the case, shoehorned himself into the case, and then within a matter of minutes, not even 10 minutes now it's down to a few minutes, he said, oh yes, he's definitely inflicted injury, just give me the notes and I'll work something out, and then he worked something out. But we're going to come back to Dr. Evans later in this video. If third-party involvement, would you expect to see the same indicator? Stephen Brearey. It is relatively easy to manipulate fluid to administer drugs and or to block an airway. There seems to be a theme with multiple births, triplets and twins, and the more stable infant being the one to collapse. So that is an utterly farcical statement for two reasons. Firstly, to say that the more stable infant is collapsing is ridiculous. It's just simply not true. But even if it was true, why would Lucy deliberately attack the stable infant? You know, she's an intelligent woman, she's an experienced nurse, she's observant. If she genuinely wanted to cause malignant harm, she would attack the one that was collapsing. She would attack the one that was less stable. She would attack the one that was vulnerable. Why would she attack the one that was more stable? That just doesn't make any sense. It's also not true, of course. And then the second thing is, he mentions there's a theme with multiple births. Now, we see that included in the court case. We're going to be looking at more of the closing statement of Nick Johnson in the foreseeable future, and we'll see that he makes a big deal out of trying to link cases together in families. So this seems to be a theme that the police seized upon and then passed on to prosecution. What Dr. Stephen Brearey doesn't say is how much more vulnerable twins and triplets are. And there is a serious question mark regarding whether they should have been born at the Countess of Cheshire in the first place. I think most medics and most doctors that observe this unit and observe the details of the case will conclude that they shouldn't have been born at this hospital. Of course, that somehow slipped the attention of Dr. Brearey, just as he failed to mention that twins and triplets can be more vulnerable, which of course the police don't know. Then Susie Holt makes a comment here. Case of baby twins. One twin was on CPAP, but baby not needing any respiratory support was the one that collapsed. From clinical perspective, neither were anticipated to collapse, but clinically the one on respiratory support was more vulnerable. So I think here she's referring to child A and child B. Concern we have is, could something be done deliberately to harm them? We don't know. I don't know if this is something we just have to live with. We would rather there was some explanation. Our concern is, have enough questions been asked? Can we be satisfied that we have done all we can to confirm if there is something more going on? So that is, I think, a perfectly reasonable statement from Dr. Jayaram. There's two things that I would say in response to that. Firstly, why are you going to the police to investigate this? Why aren't you going to the Care Quality Commission, being a whistleblower and asking for a medical investigation? I'll tell you the simple reason for that, as I've already mentioned. It's an act of self-preservation. They know that this is a way for them to do things without facing any consequences, without having to face the consequences of their actions. That's why they're doing this. It's as simple as that. The second thing is, why would they believe that the police could do this? And then, of course, the police didn't do this because the police got Dr. Evans involved. So, in terms of asking enough questions, that didn't happen. There weren't any questions asked. Within a matter of minutes, Dr. Evans had already decided. So there was no forensic multidiscipline review, as they're stating should happen. Not an unreasonable comment, but that just never happened in this case. The police just ended up getting Dr. Evans involved. And as soon as Dr. Evans was involved, it escalated rapidly. So then Jayaram says, nobody has talked to junior doctors who have been involved. We appreciate that a lot of time has passed since then. We, at the end of the day, are responsible for patient safety on the ward. The buck stops with us. Again, that's a fairly reasonable statement. Then Stephen Brearey says, to put in perspective, consultant who joined us from Crewe, he has never experienced anything like this in 5 years as a consultant. So what? I mean, that's 5 years. It's virtually no time at all. So basically, he's been working for 5 years, and like this is his worst year of the 5. To be fair, they did have a very bad spike. They did have a significant spike on the unit. It was a poor performing unit. You know, I'm being slightly facetious to say that, but so much stock is put in this court case, And during this so-called investigation on, oh, we'd never seen anything like this before. Oh, we'd never seen a rash like this before. Oh, we'd never seen discoloration before. Oh, someone's been working in crew and they've never seen anything like this before. So what? So what? It doesn't have any relevance to anything. The thing is, because they'd had so many deaths, I do think it's reasonable that they became concerned. They should have been concerned. The problem is they jumped to irrational, rash conclusions that were not backed up by any evidence. Then they became obsessed with them. And as we'll see as this meeting continues, they were willing to say things that just don't stand up to scrutiny in order to push their theory. And they clearly came to this meeting, to say that they came to this meeting with the intention of giving an objective view of what's happening on the unit is, I mean, that would be stretching the truth considerably. They obviously came with the intention of outlining their concerns about Lucy Letby, which is exactly what they did. You couldn't possibly come away from this meeting with any other feeling other than, right, they're concerned about a nurse, and then the police just honed in on that nurse very rapidly. So then Ravi Jayaram says, we all have concerns. Nothing significant changed over the years to explain the deaths, e.g. the changes in patient numbers, staffing do not explain the number of deaths or collapses. So again, that's a bit of a disingenuous comment. They did have a very high level of acuity at this time. You see people in the nursing department of the hospital, in the nursing team, saying, well, we had a lot of high profile, complex cases, difficult babies to deal with. We were understaffed at the time. Cots were crammed together. We were transporting a lot of infants around, and we'd never been in that situation before. So essentially, it's a matter of opinion to say that the changes in patient numbers, the staffing, the complex infants do not explain the number of deaths or collapses. Of course, they don't mention the complex infants. We see Dr. Brearey saying, oh, they were mostly over 32 weeks, that, indicating that these were not complex cases, when in fact a lot of the infants that were put in the court case and a lot of the infants that died were either twins, triplets, very premature, very low birth weight, very vulnerable, other complications, other illnesses. So their statements just don't stand up to scrutiny. And there were infants that passed away that do fit that description, but most of them are not in the indictment. So we'll move on. We do not dispute the findings from the RCPCH report, and it has made useful suggestions for our service, but feel these are background factors. So you could argue that this is a very self-serving view. So the RCPCH report, they've come to visit, they've looked at the unit, they've made recommendations, they've made criticisms. So basically the people who work on the unit have said, yeah, that's great, but we don't think that's important. So, I mean, that's the definition of a self-serving view. And to say that their background, when you look at the acuity of the infants, the problems on the unit, the mistakes that were made, the understaffing, and all of these things collectively, they're not background factors. They're absolutely central into the outcomes of these infants, plus the fact they were very vulnerable to begin with, which is for some reason being downplayed here. So then Jayaram says the pathology report may attribute a likely cause of death, but this does not explain timing nor what caused the collapse that ultimately led to death. So I feel that this is quite a strange comment, because I feel that in usual circumstances, after you've done a pathology report and there's been a coroner, you've got to bear in mind at this hospital, this doesn't usually happen. They don't usually have these amount of reviews or this amount of attention or this amount of different bodies and different credentialed people looking at infants that have passed away. It's quite unusual, really. Now, it was probably justified given what had occurred on the unit, but usually if a pathology report gives a likely cause of death, that would be accepted. And I think the fact that they don't accept it indicates that they had become biased and they'd become obsessed with their theory that Lucy was to blame. So then the police say, agreed, not challenging the pathology findings, but the fact is the cause of collapse leading to death has not been identified. So there's two problems here. Firstly, the police don't know that causes of death are not always identified, particularly for neonates. That's the first thing. Far from it, in fact. And then secondly, this is just kind of indicative of a broader attitude that Cheshire Police, in particular, I would suggest it would be similar potentially similar at least, in other constabularies. But it's indicative of the attitude that Cheshire Police have, where they just don't question the consultants at all. So the consultants walk in there and they seem almost starstruck that two consultants have walked into the police station, and then they just start saying things and then they just note them down. There's no there's no questioning of the consultants, or why do you think this way, or why are we being told about this, or let alone are they being considered of any wrongdoing, whether malignant or otherwise. It's just, oh well, the consultants want us to do this, so we'll do it. I just don't see any justification for that. But the fact is that it's not. The police should have retained some scepticism, which they clearly didn't. They clearly just allowed these two to walk into the room and just say whatever they wanted to get off what was off their chest, and we can see how little questioning of that takes place. Then Stephen Brearey says, survival rate for babies over 32 is nearly 100%. For 6 of our babies to have died who are over 32 weeks to die is not right. So this is the point that I was mentioning about they keep going on about the over 32 weeks. All of these babies should be absolutely fine. Blah, 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 blah. Well, the fact is, most of those infants are not in the indictment. For example, there were 3 infants that died on the unit with 39, and 40 weeks, full termers. None of those are in the indictment. The majority of infants that died were not 100% okay. They had serious problems. They were very premature in many cases. They were very low birth weight, etc., etc. So the impression that he's communicating is just simply inaccurate. So then the police make a note, reviewed the key statements outlined in the report. The historical annual number of deaths in the neonatal unit at the hospital has been between 1 and 3. From June 2015, there were 13 deaths in the 13 months. The probability of this increase in mortality occurring by chance alone is very low. So firstly, how do you know that? And secondly, even if we assume for the sake of argument that's true, this is where the police get so confused. It doesn't have to mean that there is a solitary cause, let alone the malignant hand of a nurse. It could be, it's more often than not, and I've discussed this in previous videos, it's just a nuanced clinical picture of complex interlocking factors. It's not just simply that, oh, there's more deaths than usual, so now we need to find a singular reason for that. It just doesn't work that way. But obviously, again, the police don't understand this. So many of the babies who died were born at gestations where death is statistically very unlikely. So I've already dealt with that. Of the babies who died, most deteriorated unexpectedly without explanation at the time or subsequently. It is very unusual not to see any clinical evidence for a baby becoming unwell, e.g. you might expect to see their heart beating faster or the level of oxygen in their blood changing. In some of these cases, there was no recovery to adequate resuscitation measures. For this to occur in such a large number of babies is highly unusual and could be considered as suspicious. So the problem with this is that, as I've mentioned previously, they missed the clinical signs. So I've spoken to many nurses and numerous doctors, and they all say you must monitor neonates very closely. If you don't monitor neonates very closely, you can miss things, and if you miss things, they can deteriorate, and before you know it, they're in serious trouble. So what seemed like sudden collapses, sudden deteriorations, were not sudden. In fact, they were taking place over a period of time. But even though they missed clinical signs, the fact that they're characterising these deteriorations and collapses as sudden is still not accurate, because we see actually in the court case and in the medical information that we know about these infants that was collated even on the unit, that some of the collapses are not sudden. And also, of course, another thing we know is many of the collapses were not included in the court case ultimately. So next thing Stephen Brearey says is, did thematic review in January 2016 looking at the 9 senior nursing staff from Liverpool Women's Hospital looking at themes, trends. Staffing was included in that report, staffing on shift, designated nurse, consultant on duty, name of junior doctors present, could not find link with consultant or doctors. So there he's just very conveniently ruling himself out of the whole process. So again, remember at the start they say, we're not coming here to point the finger at a nurse. That's the last thing we're doing. And then as the meeting continues, you see what they're actually doing. Then Jayaram says, all collapses and deaths would involve wide range of professionals. Nigel Wenham, at what point were concerns raised? I don't know who's written this, but they're not grammatically impressive, that's for sure. Stephen Brearey, from December, I raised some concerns. The first discussion took place in June 2015 when we had 3 deaths within a few weeks. This was highly unusual. We met with Ian Harvey and head of risk at that time. We reviewed all 3 cases. Could not identify any issues regarding clinical practice. At that time, the unit manager noticed that Lucy Letby, the nurse, was present at all 3. That was the first conversation. So this comment implies that they named Lucy Letby in the meeting, but it's more likely just to be a writing error from the police, in my opinion. It's possible that they named Lucy, but I think it's more likely they didn't, and they've got it the wrong way around. It's supposed to say the nurse and then Lucy Letby in brackets, but they've cocked it up and written Lucy Letby with the nurse in brackets. Nevertheless, they might as well have just walked in there and said, we suspect Lucy Letby has killed babies on the unit. Right, just get on with it. And then walked out, to be honest, because all this meeting does is identify Lucy and blame Lucy. Despite the fact at the start they said, hey, we've got an open mind and we're not here to just blame everything on a nurse. Nothing could be further from the truth. But they're just making it clearer and clearer and clearer as it continues. We suspect a nurse. Lots of suspicious things have gone on. The nurse is always there. Did we mention the nurse is around all the time? You know, and they'll still claim, hey, that. I mean, Brearey's made this comments in Der Spiegel this week. Obviously too scared to speak to an English newspaper. But he made some comments about, there was just so many unusual things happening on the unit, what we were supposed to do. Characterising his behaviour as like the only possible thing they could have done. And of course he's denied in this meeting that they've engaged in a campaign against Lucy Letby when it's very, very clear that they did. And I think all the truth about that hasn't come out yet. Hopefully it will eventually. But they came into this meeting with one intention, and one intention only, and that is to pique the interest of the police, as Dr. Jayaram said himself, and to finger Lucy Letby, to raise suspicions around Lucy Letby, to indicate that they believed that Lucy Letby was in the wrong. All 3 reported to Coroner had post-mortems. Ravi was clinician for one of the infants. He attended inquest, cause of death unascertained. Stephen Brearey, one infant collapsed unexpectedly and died. His twin collapsed but recovered. This was unexpected and unusual. Now looking back, we think this was suspicious. She had unusual rash. So here we see Dr. Stephen Brearey introducing the unusual rashes that we would see feature in the court case. So if we actually were to look at the clinical picture of child A and child B, then we could see that it's very, very different from how Stephen Brearey is presenting it. Again, of course, he's not mentioned the vulnerability of twins, but I'm going to just briefly now I'm not going to read out the whole thing because we've done this before, but I just want to give a few details on the clinical picture of child A. So child A was a 31 plus 2 7th week, so immediately not over 32 weeks. 1.66 kilogram birth weight, twin 2, male infant, delivered by emergency cesarean section for maternal hypertension. Mother had antiphospholipid syndrome and gestational cholestasis at birth. Child A required resuscitation but stabilised. The next day, 1600, the intravenous peripheral line tissued and IV fluids were stopped, and so on. And this was, firstly, the way that they have depicted this infant is inaccurate. And secondly, there were numerous mistakes made on the unit with regard to this. And obviously that's led the panel to conclude that child A died from thrombosis, and clearly there was no evidence of air embolism. So this is a case where they've introduced the strange rashes. So I haven't discussed that at this point because we're going to return to that later in the video. I don't want to go over all these details now because no doubt I will do again. But there's post-mortem of child A which shows a recent non-occluding thrombus in the liver, which means there was a recent thrombotic event. So we're not talking about, the infant, Yeah, he was absolutely fine. There he was playing in his cot, and then he just collapsed for no reason. Just absolute rubbish. So then the conversation continues. So the baby improved after intervention, being brought into the unit and started on treatment, then collapsed and died on day. So I don't know why this is suppressed, but it is. So the important thing to know about that is the infant may appear to improve, but if it has underlying conditions and underlying problems that are not recognised and not treated, then this can be a pretty superficial recovery. All blood markers did not indicate worsening infection. Post-mortem still spots inflammation in the lungs, but this does not explain the improvement in the baby health, and then collapse. Explain collapse. So that's the police note. So Dr. Stephen Brearey may not understand why this infant has collapsed, but there were very clear reasons why this infant experienced difficulties. And frankly, the explanation that was provided in court was an explanation that is almost completely without merit, particularly once you know how Dr. Evans arrived at his theories. So then Dr. Brearey says, babies do not have cardiac arrest like adults do. Collapse on unit would be inadequate breathing. Babies stop to breathe, may stop breathing, dropped oxygen levels, breathing stops, and oxygen level for period, heart slows down. This requires cardiac massage. So let's go over that and see if we can actually make sense of that sentence. Babies do not have cardiac arrest like adults do. That's fine. Collapse on unit would be due to inadequate breathing. Fair enough. That I'm not even sure that's necessarily true, but I'm not in a position to challenge that. Babies stop to breathe. Not sure what is meant by that. May stop breathing. Dropped oxygen levels, breathing stops, and oxygen level for period, heart slows down. This requires cardiac massage. So I suppose what he's trying to convey, I'm sure he said it more clearly in the meeting, is that you will usually, if there's a collapse, there will be evidence of diminished or stopped breathing, reduced oxygen levels, possibly a reduced heart rate, and then you have to give a cardiac massage in order to address this. It's possibly one of the worst sentences ever been written, but these babies had apnea, stopped breathing, increased number result in desaturation. These babies just stopped out of the blue. So it's pretty much the same theme. Dr. Brearey is asserting that these babies stopped out of the blue, and he may very well believe that. But if you have inexperienced doctors, inexperienced registrars, junior doctors being too heavily involved with these infants, they haven't got a neonatologist, they don't have experienced staff, they're understaffed, they're bringing in part-time nurses, they've got rid of their advanced neonatal nurse practitioner. It's not a well-stocked unit. It's not a unit that is particularly operational in terms of space. They've got sewage on the unit, they've got pseudomonas on the unit, they've got endemic sepsis. If you put all these things together, then these are not infants just with the heart rate stopping out of the blue. This is a unit that had a lot of problems, and also they're infants that had a lot of chronic problems that were mismanaged and which medical errors were made. So when he says they just stopped out of the blue, that's just untrue. So then we do see the police asking a reasonable question. How do we know that? And as you observe this, you see the calamity that has occurred here, where it's just a series of avoidable mistakes, and it's just there were so many opportunities to stop this that just didn't happen. So here the police are trying to inquire and make sure that they've got their facts correct. So obviously Jayaram and Brearey then answer this question of how do we know that? And the police, perhaps not unreasonably, just assume, well, they're consultant paediatricians, they must know what they're talking about. They must be right. They're obviously not in a position to question what they're saying medically, so they just assume they're correct, but of course they weren't correct. So at this point, this could have been stopped right now. Probably, almost certainly, in my view, what the police should have done was seek a second opinion. That they never did. They just got Dr. Evans and then let him run riot, basically. And they should have got a second medical opinion. They should have done the due diligence on Dr. Evans, obviously. But they did overtrust the consultants, there's no doubt about that, but they must have thought the consultants know what they're talking about. And that would be a reasonable assumption. And it would also be a reasonable assumption that the police can't do anything to question what they're saying. Anyway, Dr. Jayaram says they are on monitors. However, monitors don't keep digital record of numbers. Nurses document observation from monitors hourly on observation charts. Most babies were at gestation. So again, this emphasis that all the babies were at gestation, I mean, that's just completely untrue. Firstly, most babies on a neonatal ward are not at gestation. They're premature. Even a 32-week baby is premature. It's not a full-termer, that's for sure. Yes, the outlook for a 32, 33-weeker can be better than a severely premature infant, but to say most babies were at gestation is just categorically untrue. I mean, it's just not accurate at all. Anyway, he said would not expect these sort of things happening. You know, obviously he's emphasised that numerous times by now. Then Jayaram said these babies simply did not respond as expected. Interventions did not result in expected results. The baby interventions were put in place. There was evidenced electrical activity of the heart, but he did not have output, no pulse. Not many things can cause this. He had adrenaline. He did not respond. Half hour without output. This is child A. So we've been over child A already. We've been over the problems with child A already, but they seem very concerned about child A, that's for sure. Then Susie Holt makes one of her rare comments in this meeting. There is a big difference between adult and neonatal practice. With intervention, we would expect to see some response, and statistics support this. Not an unreasonable comment, but most of the statistics relate to competent units, of course. What was the thought process with no response? So Ravi Jayaram says, in one-off, there could be an explanation. So they, again, this just indicates they became fixated on this statistical coincidence. So firstly, a spike in deaths, and then Lucy seemed to be around quite a lot. And we've seen them say already, in other circumstances, some of these deaths wouldn't be suspicious. And indeed, there aren't suspicious explanations because we know now the medical picture and the clinical picture related to these infants. But anyway, Stephen Brearey goes on. We would expect the post-mortem to find evidence to support cause of death. The pickup rate from pathology has not informed us as to why the babies have collapsed. So that's not an unreasonable comment, I suppose. However, if you're going to pick him up on the first sentence, the post-mortem did cite a cause of death in virtually every case. There was only one in which they said the cause was unascertained, but they just don't accept the post-mortems. So we had this earlier in the discussion. They said the cause of death has been established, but that's not good enough. We want to know why every single collapse happened. So to now say we'd expect the post-mortem to find evidence to support the cause of death, well, it did. You've already said that it did. The second sentence is more reasonable. Dr. Jayaram, we accept in medicine some uncertainty. We accept cognitive bias. So they accept some uncertainty, but there's only one unascertained death or one death where there's any doubt, but they don't accept that. They also claim that they accept cognitive bias, but have they really genuinely considered their own cognitive bias? Because there is enormous confirmation bias written all over everything they did for 2 years, and confirmation bias is at the absolute heart of why they're in the police station in the first place. Then he says, we can't see explanation. Is it people, practice, building, accommodation? It is big leap of faith to suggest these all lined up and led to the deaths. All of these factors, acuity unit, medical and nursing staff levels, are there and common to other neonatal units in the country. So there's a few things to say here. First of all, the people, practice, building and accommodation are contributing factors. The main, arguably they're not the major reason. They are all contributing factors. Arguably the major reason is that these babies had clinical signs that were missed. Now you can have the best building in the world, the best accommodation in the world. Obviously this is related to people and practice. But if you don't see clinical signs, then infants of this nature will deteriorate and they will die. It's as simple as that. So yes, of course, having an older, cramped unit is not going to result in a massive spike in deaths. It can be a contributing factor, but if you don't monitor the infants adequately, which they weren't doing enough ward rounds, they didn't have a right number of people, they didn't have the right skill set, they were getting people in on part-time contracts, then if you miss things, then these babies will deteriorate. It's as simple as that. And that is what is not being communicated, not being understood, and therefore the police are not hearing this, and they just cannot understand the case. It's an intellectual impossibility for them. So the second thing I want to add as well is this assertion about all of these factors being common to other neonatal units is just rubbish, because a certain number of level 2 units may be downgraded. We don't know how many exactly. It's difficult to get statistics, but it's not going to be a common thing, that's for sure. Very few neonatal units, level 2 units, are deemed to be incompetent and then downgraded and never upgraded back to their level 2 status. That's exactly what happened to the Countess of Chester. And of course, he hasn't got a clue about the acuity of the unit, the medical and nursing staff levels, no idea whatsoever. And even if what he was saying was true, which he has no evidence to support that whatsoever, you can still have spikes in any large data set. This is one of the confusions, the confusing aspects of this seemingly for people, is that it's unusual, therefore it's suspicious. Well, no, it's just unusual. You get unusual data. If you have a massive data set, you'll always get unusual data. Always. This actually is not unexpected when you look at the things that he's just mentioned, plus the fact they missed clinical signs, plus the sanitary conditions on the unit, plus all the problems collectively they had. This spike, Michelle Warden described it to me, or she either described it to me or said this as a comment to The Guardian, it was an accident waiting to happen. And that's absolutely true. And she recognised this long before this perfect storm of factors that all came together and caused the problems on the unit. So for him to characterise things in this way and to make these statements is just... to say that it's specious would be an understatement. So then they continue. Stephen Brearey says post-mortem for one infant was done urgently, so now he's criticising the post-mortem. Ravi Jayaram, if any concerns we would escalate to the coroner, would discuss and agree process. Stephen Brearey, all neonatal deaths are discussed with the coroner. So of course this has happened, but they're still not happy. It's not like there hasn't been a coroner, there has. But even after the coroner's looked at them, they're still not happy. So then they go on and on. This has already been mentioned, but now we see it stated again. There is an association with a member of staff who was present during the majority of instances when the babies unexpectedly deteriorated. When this member of staff was put onto day shifts for 3 months, no sudden collapses occurred during the night. Previous to this change in her work, I'm not sure that's even true. Previous to this change in her work pattern, in 6 out of 9 deaths, the arrests occurred between midnight and 4 a.m. When this member of staff was no longer working on the unit, July the 16th to present, there have been no neonatal deaths on the unit and no unexpected or unexplained sudden deteriorations. So the police are now already discounting the downgrading of the unit because the consultants have said you should just discount that. Just forget about the fact that we're not working with the same type of infants anymore. Just forget about the acuity and all that kind of stuff, and the police have dutifully done exactly what they've been told to do. This member of staff was present on the unit during the deterioration of the children who died, and then there's a list of some of them. So remember, they're not supposed to be going in there and saying it's all Lucy's fault. They're supposed to be giving a balanced view. The gestation at birth of the babies who died was between 27 weeks and 40 weeks. 6 babies were born later than 32 weeks gestation. The redesignation of the unit from July 2016 cannot therefore be the only reason why there have been no deaths or sudden unexpected deteriorations of babies on the unit since July 2016. So there's a few things to say about this again. So firstly, they've been given a misleading impression of the infants that were ultimately involved in the indictment. Secondly, they were legally warned by Corinne Slingo that when you downgrade the unit, there will be a change in what occurs with the outcome of infants, and this will make it difficult to identify the cause. But that now this is just being hand-waved away, and the police obviously don't understand what is happening because they've got no prospect of doing so. And then there's a comment, an external neonatologist from London has identified 4 children who require further forensic review. Of course, that never happened. Further to a report, a consensus between 3 Countess of Chester paediatricians and an external neonatologist from the Liverpool Women's Hospital. So we'll just have to go on to the next page. Liverpool Women's Hospital have identified a further 4 for whom the cause of death is still unexplained. So, of those infants there, 2 of them weren't in the indictment, of course, and Child C and Child D, to say that their cause of death was unexplained when you look at the clinical picture of the infants is ridiculous. I'm not going to do that now because one of the children had an enormous amount of chronic problems and the other infant just suffered incredible medical mismanagement on the unit. An unexplained rash was observed for at least 3 babies. This was initially thought to be due to infection by the clinical teams. However, the rashes resolved spontaneously despite the babies being very ill. This is highly unusual and may indicate a possible unnatural cause of death. So, isn't it interesting that here on the 15th of May, the paediatricians come in and mention these rashes, and then coincidentally, we see those rashes being cited by Dr. Evans completely incorrectly. Isn't that an extraordinary coincidence? Then Dr. Ravi Jayaram says, we did some reading and found that situation called air embolism, small amounts of free air in circulation can obstruct flow of blood into the lungs, free oxygen can be picked up. There is a rash associated with this diagnosis. Isn't it interesting and coincidental that Dr. Jayaram came in and mentioned this, and then coincidentally Dr. Evans cited that repeatedly in his report, again completely incorrectly. And then Susie Holt explained that we associated infection with rashes. This was not the case here, not a recognisable rash outside these collection of babies. And then Ravi Jayaram, air embolism can happen deliberately or accidentally, for example, cannula administering drugs. What could happen? There could be an error in how the cannula is managed. So at least Dr. Jayaram is indicating here that this can happen accidentally. Of course, Dr. Evans was somehow able to completely rule out the accidental introduction of air, even though Professor Owen Arthurs did a study at Great Ormond Street Hospital and found that many infants accidentally have air present within them, but Dr. Evans was able to rule this out completely. And then there's some comments about babies surviving. Dr. Jayaram, my understanding is that unless the PM is done very soon, there will not be any evidence on the post-mortem. So one of the things I'd like to mention here is that in these cases of supposed air embolism, one of the clinical indicators of air embolism is frothy blood in one of the ventricles of the heart. This is mentioned in one of the documents from Thirlwall that there was no frothy blood present, and no one has ever suggested that there'd be any frothy blood because none was ever discovered. And these children had pathologists look at them, they had coroners look at them, they had more qualified people than anyone that was involved in this court case look at them, let alone Dr. Evans, Jayaram and Brearey. And there's no evidence of frothy blood. So that's one of the main indicators of air embolism. If that's not present, then it should be a red flag for any so-called diagnosis of air embolism. So, closing comments. Dr. Ravi Jayaram, we are used to dealing with uncertainty. This is what we do. We have said we want enough done to rule out foul play. So, this is a fair comment. And again, the Countess of Chester wrote to Cheshire Police on the 2nd of May and said, will you exclude unnatural causes? Ravi Jayaram saying the same thing here. What he said here in this statement is perfectly reasonable. The problem is, the only person that ever contacted Cheshire Police was Dr. Evans, who just walked in there and immediately said, oh, it's malignant harm, give me all the notes, give me a year and I'll have worked out what's happened to all these infants. It will be malignant harm in every situation involved with Lucy Letby. Ian Harvey suggested getting another neonatal review. Jane Horden refers to forensic, but what this means. So, I'll just explain this. They wanted to do a forensic review, but they couldn't understand themselves on the unit what is meant by a forensic review. Now, it seems to me that it should involve people of several disciplines who investigate the infants thoroughly. Essentially, what occurred in the panel now with 26 experts. But they didn't seem to know what to do on the unit. They didn't seem to know what was meant by a forensic review. So that's what he's actually referring to. Stephen Brearey then says, we were very worried. The triplets, there was no explanation. She was the named nurse. Other nurses have gone off work with stress. She didn't. So again, Lucy is being raised as a suspect here, but also this argument about she didn't go off work with stress while others did go off work with stress, that was an argument used by the prosecution. So it's being passed on from consultants to the police to the prosecution and then just repeated uncritically in court. Like the fact she didn't go off work with stress is meaningless. What does that have to do with anything? You know, everyone's an individual. Everyone has different psychological, physical reactions to things. And just because other nurses had to go off work feeling stressed and feeling unwell, which is a legitimate response, and Lucy didn't, that doesn't mean that there's something suspicious going on. It's just different people responding in a different way to a situation, as would occur all over the world in various situations. We all respond differently. One of the primary things that you say in whether it's medicine, whether it's the study of anatomy, whether it's something like nutrition. I remember writing this in the first book that I ever ghostwritten with a nutritionist. Everybody's body works differently. Otherwise, you'd get the same clinical outcomes for people all the time. And every time you dealt with a situation, you could do the same thing and it would always work out the same way. It doesn't, because people's anatomies, people's anatomical reactions, people's psychological makeup is completely different. Psychology is even harder to understand than the anatomy. People, it's very difficult to understand why people do certain things. Our motive is different. We don't even really know if there's such a thing as free will or not. I believe that there is, but I can't prove it. So to just say, well, she didn't go off work with stress, so therefore it's suspicious, is just absolute crap, to be fair. And then it says, duty executive was happy for nurse to remain on duty at that time. When expressed our concerns, we don't think the executives understood our concerns. So I think they have. I think there's been a very long and extensive dialogue that's taken place. The problem is that you never gave them any evidence. So when this case was passed to the police, it was passed to the police with no evidence, as we know. This is the first time you've presented any evidence, and as we now know, you presented a lot of pretty shoddy evidence. In January, we met with the chief executive, all 7 of us. We were told we have spoken to family, don't cross the line, we are dealing with it. Every paediatrician were worried about her going back to work, and none of us were happy with her returning back to work. We don't feel this is acceptable. This has not been investigated properly. So remember, they're not fingering a nurse. They're not blaming a nurse here. They've come here with an entirely open mind, and they don't wish to push the police in any particular direction. And also, again, there's this repeating of the claim that, every paediatrician was worried. It was nothing to do with me, Gov. It's not as if I ran a 2-year campaign trying to convince them what to think. And then Ravi Jayaram says, I don't want the obvious fractious relationship between us and the executive. This is not why we want you here. We are not sure the process. Reports have asked the right questions. We want to exclude is there anyone who is deliberately harming these babies. So, basically they did a classic good cop, bad cop here. Dr. Jayaram was the good cop and Stephen Brearey was the bad cop at this meeting. And Dr. Jayaram tried to, hey, we're being perfectly reasonable. And Dr. Brearey was like, just blame everything on the nurse, At a meeting in January, executive read out a letter from the nurse that stated she was exonerated by reviews to date, which is true. She was exonerated by them. She should have been exonerated. Frankly, she should have gone for constructive dismissal. She never should have tried to work on the unit again, and I wouldn't be sitting here making this video. Ravi Jayaram, we fully understand the impact of investigation, damaging to the trust, the neonatal unit and staff, and the impact on the families of babies. At the end of it, you may ask what was the point. What indeed was the point? Speaking for myself, we are not comfortable as worried about the safety of our patients. Now that's fair. It's fair for them to be worried about the safety of the patients, but if they were genuinely worried about them, they would have gone to the Care Quality Commission or a similar body. They would have done whistleblowing and they would have asked for a medical review. They wouldn't have gone into the police, having indicated that it's important to pique the interest of the police, and then told them numerous things that are completely inaccurate. So in summary, there were several key themes that arise from this meeting. The first thing is that the meeting takes place on the 15th of May, and just 3 days before this, Cheshire Police had no intention of investigating because there was no evidence. Prior to this, neither Brearey or Jayaram had produced any evidence. We know this because the case was passed to the police with no evidence. At the beginning of the interview, the consultants claimed to be open-minded, but then they made it absolutely clear that they suspected a nurse and also blatantly identified this nurse. From the police's perspective, it is obvious that they trusted the consultants far too much, never treated them with any suspicion, couldn't understand what was a nuanced situation, and fastened onto the nurse suspect that Brearey and Jayaram identified far too quickly. Throughout the meeting, we saw the classic psychological ploy of Dr. Stephen Brearey playing the bad cop and Dr. Ravi Jayaram playing the good cop. Ironically, Cheshire Police fell for this. Both consultants completely absolved themselves of any responsibility or blame while downplaying mistakes made on the unit and the general clinical picture. Information provided was often inaccurate. For example, they exaggerated the wellness of babies, they provided the wrong impression regarding acuity, they didn't properly convey the significance of twins and triplets, they suggested infants collapsed for no reason when clinical signs were missed, and they made erroneous comparisons with other units. I should also add that Dr. Jayaram finally remembered during this meeting that he'd seen Lucy Letby attempt to murder a baby some 450 days earlier. In conclusion, all I would say is that this meeting is absolutely central to the conviction of Lucy Letby. Firstly, the investigation will never take place without it, and secondly, we see several themes being lifted straight out of this meeting and being put into the court case. Now, I will leave people watching to reflect on why that happened without making any comments myself. All I can say is that this meeting doesn't reflect particularly well on anyone that was involved.